Welcome you to a study of the book of Esther. And what we're going to do tonight, and I need to clarify this, basically most of our lesson tonight will be things leading into the book of Esther. And we're going to do two things initially. One, we're going to look at how the book was used in later centuries. And anyway, we'll talk about that. But the other thing I felt like would be helpful, when I think of the Old Testament, and let me just say it this way, for 12 years I got to help teach in a school of biblical studies, and we had a lot of people came to school that, like for several of them, had been baptized maybe a year or so, and had never really read the Old Testament. And so I asked if I could do Introduction to the Bible and Introduction to the Old Testament, because it's always helpful to kind of have a flow of like a narrative or a story. But when I think of the Old Testament, I think of a sideways V, like it starts here, and then the longer you go toward the end of the Old Testament, the greater variety both of writers and other things. And the biggest single factor in this whole thing that most people don't understand, because they read it but they don't have any place for it to fit, is that the prophets, as in Isaiah, Jeremiah, are all going to come relatively toward the end of the Old Testament. And until you have the dividing of the kingdom, David is going to be the king in about 1000. And then when Solomon dies in 931, the tribes split into the northern 10 tribes and the southern. And it's going to be only after that period of time that the prophets come in. And so, again, anyone visiting, we have outlines on both tables, and it'll be really, really helpful for you to do tonight. I want us to turn, if you just turn to the very back page, just turn it over. And what we're going to start with is that we're going to say centuries later. And so this is, we don't even know if this may even be after the Old Testament is completed. But centuries later, then there were various books that were used for very specific events, but we want to get into that. Do you have an outline? They're on the table. Sorry if you just came in, just so you won't be lost in it. I just hate for you to be there and wonder what on earth are they doing. It'll be bad enough for the people online. At least we have the excuse they're a long ways away. Thank you. So if you look on the very back page under the dotted line, there are 3 times a year from the law of Moses, and this is given in 3 specific places, where God says, I want the men to, and eventually it will be come to Jerusalem after Solomon builds the temple, but to go to the place where the high priest is, where the ark is, and he says there's going to be 3 annual feasts each year. And this is going to be a part of how the book of Esther is going to be used, even though we'll see the context of it. And so, and there's other times, and there's several feasts, but a minimum, God says, these 3 times I want you to do this. But, for example, we know, like from Luke 2 with Jesus' families, sometimes it was mom, dad, and the kids. We visited Hong Kong for a mission conference while we were living in Australia. We came to a 6-lane street with a trolley in the middle, and we kind of came down this alley, and we turned around and cannot find our 5-year-old son anywhere. He's gone. First thought, how do you call the grandparents and say, well, I don't know how we tell you this, but we lost your grandson in Hong Kong. And so what we decided to do was we're going to take 5 minutes to see if we can find him, and then we call the police. Has he been kidnapped? What's happening? This isn't a racist comment, but we don't look like the majority of the people in Hong Kong. He has blonde, white hair. He doesn't look like anyone local. But he is not to be found. And I just can't tell you the pitter-patter that's going on, and not even trying to figure out how Mom is doing. And there's a group of 4 or 5 of us, and so we're looking and looking and looking, and finally, one of us look across the street, and a European couple has seen this little boy across the street, and they're showing him stuff in the shop window looking for us, trying not to panic. He has crossed 6 lanes of traffic and 2 tram lines, and is on the other side of the street, and thankfully at least we found him. Okay, Mom, we've been going all day, and we're looking around, and where's Jesus? Oh, he's with so-and-so. Well, where's Jesus? How's Mom going to feel when we've been gone a whole day and we can't find our boy? And I can just hardly imagine. And so all I'm saying is that there were times that Mom, Dad, and the kids came, but men were to do that trip a minimum of 3 times. When you read the latter part in book number 5 in the Psalms, from 120 to 134, you'll see the little heading, Songs of Ascent. And you'll hear expressions like in Isaiah, let's go up to the mountain, the hill of the Lord, and Jerusalem is this city set on a hill. And so as these pilgrims, as these sojourners came, then these songs from 120 to 135 were songs that they often sang as they made the journey and went up to Jerusalem. So in time, and this again is after our Old Testament's written, in time, the Jews selected 5 of the smaller books, and they were called the 5 scrolls. And so at 4 feasts and 1 fast, which we'll explain, then these books are going to be read annually. And so we have, as we make the journey, the songs of ascent that we're going to sing as we go up to Jerusalem for the feast. And then once we get there, and I want you to look at these, and let me go ahead and explain. The 9th day of Ab, if you see that in bold, was a day of fasting to remember initially the destruction of Jerusalem, 587, 586, and then later they continued to do this for the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. But we'll look at these in just a second. In April, and I still shake my head, during the Passover they read Song of Solomon. Just put that on the back burner for a second and we'll keep going. Then in May, when they came back for Pentecost, then they would read the book of Ruth. Now that one clicks. I think, yep, I understand, because it was about the harvest and the other things there. In August, the 9th of August, the month of Ab, they would read the book of Lamentations. And I read something this week that will stick in my mind. The writer said, Lamentations was a funeral sermon about the fall of Jerusalem. And who's Jeremiah? The weeping prophet. And he writes this very precise, it's very orderly lament about the fall of Jerusalem. Then in October, and this is when the first of the Jewish year actually starts, then they would come back for the fall festival, and you'll hear Festival of Booths, Festival of Tabernacles. And I don't want to be too casual, and I've had some Jewish friends, and I don't know how they feel about this, but to me, this is like the Jewish Passover. I'm wrong. The Jewish Thanksgiving. Let me stay with us. Because, as we've said, you finish the barley harvest before you come for Passover. The wheat is going to ripen 3 or 4 weeks later, so they go back home the 50 days. They complete the wheat harvest. That's done. And then when we come to October, it's kind of like the state fair type thing. All of the fall crops are in. We've kind of got everything done. We're getting ready for the winter. And so one more time, we go to Jerusalem. We build booths, tabernacles, shelters. It's a time of worship. It's a time of celebration. There are lights in the temple and other things. And then in March, and because of the book of Esther, they celebrate the Feast of Purim. And this will take us a while to get to this, but once we kind of go through the story and the plot of what takes place in Esther, then the Jews, and they still do this, they celebrate the Feast of Purim. The couple actually stopped by today. L.R. Ramsey had an eye surgery, but L.R. and Susan, she was teaching the 4th grade, and she called me years ago, and she said, I've been reading something, and I'm not quite sure about this. Well, as time went on, and again, we're at the Feast of Purim, they would divide the group in two as they read this, and it's a feast, so what do Jewish people do at feast? They eat and they drink. So as they read through the book of Esther, then one side of the audience would boo every time they hear the word Haman, who's going to be the bad guy. And then the other side of the audience cheers every time they hear the word Mordecai. Can you imagine having a couple of cold ones, and as the night goes on and we read the story, and Susan says, please tell me they didn't do this. And I said, well, they did. And she says, well, I'm not sure if fourth graders need to know about that. But again, here's how the book came to be used in time. And so these 5 scrolls, 5 smaller books, then become a part of the annual faith cycle for faithful worshiping Jews. It's a small comparison, but for example, what does affirming the faith mean to people that worship in a congregation of 30 to 50 people to get to come and worship with 900 to 1,000 people once a year? People my generation say, oh, this is taking the place of the OCC lectureship. And so these are the kinds of things that God installed into the calendar year. And number 3, and I was just talking to Shelley about this at the very same point, if you read through the book of Leviticus, by the time you get to the end, you kind of take a deep sigh and say, aren't we glad we're not under the old covenant, the law of Moses? And Shelley was just saying, she says, I've been reading their numbers, and they were sacrificing this, and we're killing this. And she said, the amount of blood that was shed each year is just staggering. And it is. But 2 things reminds us, nothing is too trivial for God. And I try to think about this. Jack, for some of us it gets a little easier, but God knows the number of the hairs on our head. I don't. None of us know, but God does. And you just stop and think about that. How amazing is it that God knows me so well that he knows the number of hairs on our head? And so sometimes people think, well, that's not really important. Well, nothing is trivial when it comes to God, especially in items of worship. But the second one is this: God's people, when they followed the law, it was punctuated all through the year with feasts. Not fast, feasts. And one of my older preacher friends would kind of, and he wouldn't be against it, August. Be a good time for some of us to fast. But he said the reason that members of the Church of Christ are good followers of Scripture is that we believe in prayer and feasting. Bill Crane said Sunday morning, I weighed 110 pounds before I came to North Mac and started eating with you guys. But think about this. Do you remember toward the end, they find the book of the law in the temple? They've lost the Bible. And the first thing they do is, we need to start keeping these feasts. And so with all of the regulations, all the sacrifices, all of the things they were supposed to do, when the law was kept, yes, and all of this stuff went on, and that's why you had the priests and the Levites. But on the other side, there were can I use the word national holidays? You know, we're going to go for a week and camp out. I've asked this before, and not a lot of people have been. We had Boy Scout jamborees where we'd have 300, 400 Boy Scouts come and camp out and all this stuff. And there was something cooking all the time. Our scoutmaster made a to-die-for peach cobbler in a Dutch oven type thing. He had his own special recipe, and we'd do the fire and the coals and put that in. Everywhere you went, all week long, you just had this smell of just food and things going on and activities and other stuff. And especially with the Feast of Tabernacles, that's what I think of. We're at the end of the year, it's the autumn, let's build these booths and shelters and tabernacles. They have special lights in the temple. And when the law was followed, there were great seasons of what Tim was talking about, rest and recreation and worship. So toward the bottom of number 4, each generation was called to annually reflect on the events in Israel's past that shaped their daily lives. And they were to remember the great acts of God on behalf of his people. Deuteronomy 7's easy to remember, is a very important chapter. I didn't write this down, but God says, I didn't choose you because you were the strongest and the mightiest. I choose you when you were few and when you were weak to be my special people. But notice what he says. You are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the people that are on the earth. And so that's the first thing I want us to notice, is that years later, as these books are written, then, and we don't know who did it, we don't know exactly what period of time, but, and it may even be after our New Testament period, but at a point in time, as the Jews celebrated these different events, then these 5 books then accompanied the celebration, and that just became a part of both their national memory and their worship experience. So if we turn to the first page, there'll be some things on this that we won't take time to cover all the details, but we're going to step back and basically come to the story of Esther, but we're going to do it primarily in view of the nations around Israel and the impact that they had, which will influence both the books and the writing. But here's the first thing, and we mentioned this several weeks ago. Ancient people often equated a god with a geographical context. And 3 quick examples. You'll read in 1 Kings 20:23, oh, the Syrians said after the defeat, their gods are the gods of the hills. Let us fight them in the plain, and surely we will be stronger than they. And you read that section, it's very clear. They're thinking, oh, their God is a God in a geographical place. Naaman, remember, dipping the river Jordan 7 times? He asked to take 2 burdens, 2 sacks of dirt back home with him, and then apologize. There'll be times I'll have to go with my master into his temple, but he is equating the God of Israel with the soil and with the dirt. And what's Jonah doing? He gets on a ship to do what? To flee from the presence of God. And so one of the things that is going to be very significant for each of these nations is that their God is oftentimes equated and basically limited in some ways to a geographical boundary. That's why we've said, and just do highlights, there's over 30 of these. Abraham knew him as El Shaddai. There's a fabulous song, El Shaddai, El Shaddai. It goes through and just uses that name, El, the holy name of God. But it's the God who's powerful and the God who is strong. And that's primarily how Abraham addressed God. You're going to go 500 years, we have the burning bush. Moses, take off your shoes. I am who I am. And Yahweh, the Lord, becomes the holy name of God. By the time we come to Daniel, Ezekiel, and these people at the end of the Old Testament who have been carried into captivity in a foreign country, he's the God of heaven. And you think about this, what does Daniel do 3 times a day? Opens his window, and what does he do? Prays toward Jerusalem. And as far as we know, he never went home. And so to have a God who is restricted by geographical territory doesn't work when you're 900 miles away. The God of heaven, He works everywhere. And so we see this development and progression of their thinking and their descriptions of God, and the activities of the nations around them had a big impact in that. We're going to spend a little bit of time in Daniel chapter 2, and here is Daniel. And we'll notice this in a second. Daniel is carried into captivity in 606. There are 3 times that Jerusalem falls, and he's probably a mid to late teenager. And he and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego basically go into Babylonian University, but he is going to be in captivity for 70 years. So we've done this before. Whatever his age is when he goes into captivity, and if he's 12, then when he's thrown in the lion's den, he's in his early 80s. If he's 15 to 18, he's in his late 80s. And I'm sorry, but this is stuck in my mind. In the flannel graph that I saw growing up in Sayre Bible classes, he was a young man. I mean, that would just kind of be the picture. But if you start, he goes in 606, 70 years is 536. He rises to the top of the Persian Empire. He could well be in his late 80s or 90s when he's thrown into the lion's den. And so here he is, this godly young man who spends all of his life, adult life, in a foreign land. Daniel 2. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. His magicians, enchanters, and sorcerers could not interpret the dream, and in his anger the king issues a death threat. Daniel 2:17. Daniel went to his house, made the matter known. We know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here are their Babylonian names. And what does he do? He told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven. To see what we're talking about? We're not going to be talking about the burning bush. We're not going to be talking about El Shaddai. Now that we're living in a foreign land, we now refer to the Lord as the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. 2:19. The mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And there's a whole outpouring of that. Verse 28, there is a God in heaven, he tells Nebuchadnezzar, who reveals mysteries. He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay on the bed are these. And so from Daniel 2, 32 through 35, here's this enormous statue. But what we want you to notice is, notice the elements, notice the ingredients. There's a head of gold, arm and chest of silver, the middle and the thighs are of bronze, and the feet are partly of clay and partly of iron. And so here's this huge statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and the magicians and the wise men says, well, tell us your dream and we'll interpret. He says, no, you tell me the dream, which they were not able to do. And so here's this huge statue, and then what is the interpretation? Well, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. And the Babylonian Empire is going to go from 606 to 539. Then after that are going to be the Medes and the Persians. They're going to be the chest and the arms of silver. And they're roughly going to have world dominance for 200 years till the coming of Alexander the Great. And then the thighs of bronze are going to be the Greeks, the Hellenists, from 331. And then the Romans come into Palestine in 63 BC. And the feet, made partly of iron and clay, is going to be the Romans. And let me just stop for a second. This next statement about the coming of Jesus is something that nobody 900 miles away from Jerusalem could possibly have made up themselves without inspiration. I'm in a class, in fact, had a class on the Persian Empire, and our teacher was not a believer. He was a historian, but he was not a believer. We read prophecies in Daniel, and he said, these could only have been written down after the event because they're so accurate. And Kelly, I'm thinking inspiration, Holy Spirit, borne along by the Holy Spirit. And so here was an unbeliever reading biblical prophecy, and they are so precise and so clear. His only way of describing is, well, that had to be written down close to the first century because all the details are given in so carefully. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh no, this is the hand of God to do this. A stone was cut out by no human hands. It struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. And they become chaff, and the wind blows them away. But notice this, in the days of the kings, which is going to be the feet, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And what is that kingdom? It's the church. On this rock I will build my church. I will give to you the keys of the kingdom. And every time kingdom is used in the Gospels, it's in the future. And every time the kingdom is used from Acts to Revelation, it's a present reality. And from this whole thing, from the statue, here's going to come. And so here's this stellar, godly man, 900 miles away in terms of going all the way around to get there. And he is given the interpretation of the dream. And through the statue, God tells his people, here is what's going to take place for the next 500 years in world history. And you look at that statue and then you follow world history, and it happens just exactly like Daniel prophesied that it would do this. So the stone in 45 was cut from a mountain by no human hand. It broke into pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what will be after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation is sure. So I think about this a lot. Opening of the Bible in Genesis, God sends this wonderful, godly young man, 17 years of age, Joseph, south into Egypt. And later he tells his brothers, you meant it for harm, but God meant it for good. God sent me here to preserve you. And then toward the end of the Old Testament, then God sends another young man north and then back to the east to be, first of all, in the Babylonian and then the Persian Empire to, yes, help preserve the identity of his people, but to Daniel then is given the literal roadmap. This is what's going to take place in the coming centuries, and the rise and the fall of kingdoms are all within God's hands. When you look at number 2, and this is at the bottom, there's a decreasing value in the statue. You go from gold, silver, bronze, and iron and clay. But God is in control, and if you're living as an exile, in captivity, outwardly and politically and personally, you're being ruled over, but this is why they constantly refer to the God of heaven. And in the fourth kingdom, God will set up a kingdom that is never going to be destroyed. If you turn the page, here are the empires that lead us to the book of Esther. And like I said, I wanted to just kind of do this to kind of help us because we don't spend as much time in this part of Scripture as we do, especially with Abraham and with Moses and some others. But if you just look at the kingdoms, the first 3, which are the ones that are involved in the Old Testament, they're all in alphabetical order. And that may not help you, but the Assyrians come first. And then whether you call them Babylonians or Chaldeans, they come next. And then after them are the Medes and the Persians. And the end of the Persian Empire lasts 200 years, and it's Alexander the Great. And he's going to conquer the Persian Empire, and that's going to last about 250 years. And then the Romans are going to come and are going to be involved in that. So we'll do this quickly, but notice the progression. When we look at the Assyrian Empire, it runs from the middle 900s, and remember Solomon dies in 930. And here's a very interesting thing. Every time you have a strong king like David, Hezekiah, or someone, the empires around Israel are in a state of decline. And especially when God wants to punish his people for their idolatry and immorality, then a nation around them will rise up and become more powerful. But look down in the middle, see Isaiah underlined. Isaiah's ministry is from 740 to 700. And right in the middle, just up on the upper right-hand side, the northern 10 tribes are carried into captivity in 721. So just let that sink in. Every time there's a major national challenge, disaster, God raises up a major prophet. And the first 20 years, Isaiah is going to warn the northern kingdom and Judah. They don't pay any attention. And in 721, the Assyrians come, capture the northern 10 tribes, carry them away. And so the remnant that comes back are the Samaritans. So when you read about the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke, then these are the intermarried people. A few came back. And again, quick footnote, we mentioned this previous. A few years ago, we went to Israel with Everett Hufford, and Everett had grown up in Nazareth. And we're going to Mount Ebal and Gerizim and Jacob's Well. And we're traveling on a bus on the Sabbath day. Excuse me. These three guys in white robes are walking along the street, and the middle one raises his hand and is doing this. And Everett said, "Oh, that's the Samaritan high priest. He is cursing us because we are traveling on the Sabbath day." They're only walking the Sabbath journey. Well, I wouldn't know the Samaritan high priest if I shook hands with him, but having grown there and lived up there, then he knew that. And then we were at the front of the bus, and he said, yes, you can intermarry so much that you start having genetic difficulties. And so they have chosen Romania and are advertising, if you're a lady in Romania and you would like to, kind of like mail order bride, if you'd like to come and be married to a Samaritan to spread the gene pool, then they've selected one poor European nation to try to bring them in because the numbers are so small that they're having birth issues with too small of a gene pool. So they've selected one poor European nation, and they advertise, would you like to live in Samaria? And so they're trying to increase the gene pool from doing that. But here's the other thing, and I apologize, this is for my kids, but I wanted them to know this. The first set of prophets, what's the acronym? Hi, Ma. It's the little southern boy. Got a straw in his mouth. Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, and Amos are all contemporaries. And so anytime you read that first major prophet, then these other three minor, smaller prophets are also involved at the same time. And we don't have time to go into detail of that. But here's the other thing that happens. During this time period, God sends Jonah to Nineveh. They repent. And then years and years later, Nahum, and again with our kids, hear the sound alike. Nahum writes to Nineveh to tell them that they're about to be destroyed. There's a huge battle of Carchemish, 612. By 606, they completely destroy the Assyrians, and the Babylonians take over. And as we said, Nebuchadnezzar is going to capture Jerusalem 3 times, 606, 598, 97, and then destroy the city in 587, 586. And so this is where you have Jeremiah. So here's the major prophet. Isaiah is prophesying when the northern 10 tribes are taken. Jeremiah is prophesying when the southern tribes are taken away and the captivity is there. And the lament is written about the fall of Jerusalem. And then here's our 2 young men. Daniel is sent into captivity in 606. He's in the royal courts. Ezekiel is going to come with the next group, and he's among the common people, and he comes in 598, 597. But here's what's significant. Jeremiah prophesies the captivity is going to last 70 years. And you'll see that in Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 29. And I'm always amazed by this. Daniel, in captivity, is reading the book of Jeremiah, and you'll find this in Daniel 9 and verse 2, and he finds that in captivity, it's going to last 70 years. Well, how does he calculate that? He was a part of the first group. He may not have known that at the time. If he could have, he had heard Jeremiah, but he's reading Jeremiah all these years later in captivity and says the captivity is going to be 70 years. So your first two kingdoms, Assyria and Babylon, they captured people, they carried them off. When you come to the Persians, they were just the opposite. Go home. Pay your taxes, don't revolt, but go back and live in your home territories. And that's how that took place. Here's something we've mentioned, but just notice at the very bottom. Do you remember in Daniel 5:25, they're having the drunken feast, and what happens? And I always turn back over here. The handwriting comes on the wall. So when you turn the page, and even if you're what's the word for half drunk? Enumerated? Don't know that. Can someone help me? Anyway, if you've had a few drinks and you're pretty merry, but this hand appears with no body and starts writing on the wall, that's going to get everybody's attention. And what does the hand write? Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And when Daniel interprets that, mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balance and found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians, and the king is killed that night. So the Euphrates River ran through Babylon, and without telling them, the Persians had gone upstream and had built a series of dams and docks and stuff, and they diverted the entire river around the city. And when they put all the locks in place, the river was no longer there, and so the Persians walked in where the water had been and took the city the same night. Here's what I want you to notice. Do you see the dates? The first captives were exiled in 606. Babylon falls in 539. And within 3 years, Cyrus says, go home. You subtract 606 from 536, and what do you get? 70 years. God causes the rise and the fall of kingdoms to fulfill biblical prophecy. The other thing that takes place is that the temple's destroyed in 587/86. They start rebuilding it in 536, but they finally complete it in 516. And guess what? The temple also is going to take 70 years to rebuild. I'm not convinced that that's an accident. So here is going to be Nebuchadnezzar is an important king for Babylon. Cyrus the Great is going to be the major king, and very much like we're going to see Augustus, but let's notice Cyrus. Do you see 2:3 at the bottom of that page, or halfway down? Here again is an amazing prophecy. So we're going back to Isaiah 740 BC, and notice what he says, and this is the end of Isaiah 44. The Lord says of Cyrus, and this is 150 years before Cyrus the Great comes along. Cyrus is my shepherd. He will say of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation will be laid. Well, see, the temple hadn't even been destroyed. And this to me is this amazing thing of prophecy. And again, I was in a separate class, and the writer said, no, this had to be written after the time of Cyrus because it's so specific. Notice Isaiah 45. Thus says the Lord, and what's the description? Watch my hand. What did Samuel do to Saul? What did Samuel do to David? He anointed him. And God uses this word anointed, a Persian king, and the Persians aren't even a major power at this time, 150 years later, is going to be my shepherd, and he will be my chosen, my anointed one, whose right hand I have grasped. He will subdue nations, loose the belt, doors will be open, and he shall fulfill my purpose. And so here's Isaiah, and they're struggling with the northern 10 tribes being carried off into Assyria, and he prophesies of something that he could never, from a human point of view, anticipate by name. Here's the king of the Persian Empire, and the Babylonian Empire is going to rise, as God says. The handwriting on the wall, they fall that night, and then within 3 years, God sends the people back. And this to me is just an amazing thing for us just to comprehend the hand of God in working through all of this. So, and this is why we did this, we're now at the very end of the Old Testament. And I want you just to notice, and Lord willing next week, I'll give you a chart, and I've carried this in my Bible for years just to put all these in columns, but I wanted to just to go through the story. When you read 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it will end with the story of Cyrus, king of Persia. So you always look for the last event in a book. So here's 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's going to be written here very late. And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus. There's a God in heaven to build him a house at Jerusalem. And the Lord his God will be with him and let him go. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written toward the end. When you turn the page. Then here's our history books. And notice this. Esther is going to take place before Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay? When you read through our text, we do Ezra, Nehemiah, and then Esther. But in terms of chronology, Esther is going to come first, and Lord willing, we'll explain that next week. But her dates, as far as we can tell from the events with the king, are going to be 483 to 473. So we're going to have about a decade of her life in the Persian court. We've looked at Ezra. Ezra returns as the scribe in 458. And you remember, the temple has not been built. And so during Ezra's time, these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, call the people, let's rebuild, let's do this. And in 52 days, and we don't know exactly, it could be anywhere between 2 to 2.5 miles, and the wall is 40 feet high. And Kelly, help me again, our ceiling is 26.5 feet. So you nearly double, not quite, nearly double the height of our ceiling and do an 8-foot wall. And they build that with Nehemiah in 52 days. We've just finished that. That's just such an amazing story. And then Malachi is the prophet at the very end. So we're going to drop down to number 6 and 7. And like I said, Lord willing, I just want to do this to kind of help us to see where does the book of Esther fit in, what's taking place, and we'll look at some details of the Persians next week. But here's something that's significant. This is number 6 on the bottom. Esther is one of 3 Old Testament books that were written by Jews who were living outside of Palestine. Our last 2 major prophets, Daniel and Ezekiel, are in captivity. Ezekiel does have these fabulous dreams where he's picked up and brought into the temple, but still, physically, Daniel goes first. He's in the royal court. Ezekiel is out among the people, and the book of Esther. So there are 3 books that are written about the Jewish people, but the writers are not living in Israel or Palestine. The second one, well, and just notice this, any manuscripts that have survived, whether we're Dead Sea Scrolls or anything else, there are more copies of the book of Esther that have survived than any other book of the Old Testament. Which basically says, here was a book that the Jewish people read and loved, and you think of all the adversity, all the captivity, all of the prejudice and violence has been perpetrated on them. And when you count manuscripts of the Old Testament, more copies of Esther have survived from antiquity than any other book of the Old Testament. But here's the other thing, and people have just squirmed over this. Esther is one of 2 books in the Old Testament that does not mention the name of God. And people have gotten all kinds of heartburn over that. Well, how can you have a book in the Bible that doesn't mention God by name? The other's Song of Solomon. And so God is not mentioned by name, and this is one of the threads that will run through our study. The providence of God flows throughout this book. Abraham starts at the bottom of the Fertile Crescent, Ur of the Chaldees, goes up to Haran, comes and walks the length and the breadth of the land, and then God sends him into Egypt, but God's still with him. God's with Joseph when he's in prison in Egypt. God's with Daniel while he's in Babylon. The God of heaven is going to be with Esther in the royal courts of Persia. And remember how we started? Many people in the ancient world, their God was limited to a territory. And a part of the bottom line of the book of Esther is that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not geographically limited in any way. And what was true 400 years before Jesus is still true today.